The courtroom fell silent the moment she stepped onto the bench. The two officers who once shoved her into a police cruiser now sat frozen at the defendant's table, eyes wide, jaws clenched, realizing the judge deciding their fate was the very woman they wrongfully arrested. Justice hadn't just come full circle, it had walked in wearing a robe. Hi, everyone. Today we're stepping into a story that begins with something so ordinary, it could have been any of us. A sunny park bench, a good book, and a moment of peace that no one would think twice about. But what happened next turned a quiet afternoon into a national conversation. When two officers confronted her, they didn't ask. They assumed. And when they put her in handcuffs, they had no idea that the woman they just arrested would be sitting across from them again. Not as a suspect, but as their judge. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? It started the way the best afternoons do. Warm air, soft breeze, and not a single cloud above Boulder, Colorado. The kind of day when parents take their kids to the park, seniors do laps around the trail, and even the ducks seem more relaxed near the pond. Danielle Reeves, 44 years old and always thinking 3 steps ahead, had decided just for once not to think at all. She left her phone in her bag, picked a shady bench by the water, and pulled out a thick legal biography she'd been meaning to finish for months. As a civil rights attorney, Danielle's mind was usually a crowded courtroom of deadlines and motions, but today she had promised herself peace. She was maybe 20 pages in when the sound of tires grinding too fast against gravel pulled her attention away. A Boulder police cruiser had pulled up just outside the park, loop tires still turning dust. 2 officers stepped out. One was tall and lean, Officer Bradley, his name stitched neatly across his chest. The other stockier with a rigid jaw. Officer Kemp. Their eyes scanned the park briefly before locking onto Danielle, the only black woman sitting alone. Bradley was the first to speak. "Ma'am, can we speak with you for a moment?" His voice wasn't aggressive, but it carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had already made up their mind. Danielle looked up from her book, closing it carefully. "Of course," she said, voice steady. Her heart hadn't started to race yet. Not yet. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this area," Kemp added, approaching with calculated steps. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "I'm reading." Kemp didn't laugh. Neither did Bradley. "Can we see some ID?" There it was, that tightening in the chest, the quiet calculation that every person of color learns to make. Cooperate, stay calm, don't give them an excuse. "May I ask what I'm being accused of?" she said, still polite. "It's routine," Bradley said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Danielle sighed quietly and reached for her bag. A few joggers had slowed down now. A couple on a picnic blanket looked up. As Danielle handed over her driver's license, she noticed the younger woman by the swing set pull out her phone and start recording. Danielle Reeves Bradley read aloud. "What's your business here, Miss Reeves?" "I live here," she said. "I'm here to enjoy the park." "Is that a problem?" Kemp didn't answer. "Do you always carry a book like that?" Danielle stared at him. "Is that relevant?" The tension was thick now. Her voice remained calm, but she was done playing along. "Unless I'm being accused of something," she said clearly, "I'm not answering more questions." Bradley stepped forward. "Don't get smart." Danielle stood her ground. "I know the law, but their minds weren't on the law." The moment Kemp reached for her arm, it snapped something loose. "What are you doing?" she asked, sharply, startled. "Stop resisting!" Bradley barked as Kemp clasped one cuff around her wrist. A lie before an audience. People began to murmur louder now. A man nearby stood up. "I'm filming this," someone called out. Danielle didn't struggle, but the words kept coming from the officers. "Stop resisting. Don't make this harder." The cuffs clicked shut behind her, cold and cutting. They led her toward the cruiser as if she'd just committed a violent crime. As the door opened, Danielle turned her head and locked eyes with the young woman holding her phone. No words were exchanged, but that one glance, it was a silent plea. "Keep filming. Don't let this get buried." The cruiser door slammed. Inside, Danielle's hands throbbed, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from something deeper. Humiliation, disbelief, anger, and a cold, calculated resolve beginning to form like ice in her veins. She stared at her reflection in the window as the trees blurred by. She had spent her life fighting injustice. Now she was its target. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The station smelled like bleach and old paperwork. As Officer Kemp guided Danielle through the narrow hallway with fluorescent lights humming overhead, she kept her eyes forward, refusing to let them see her flinch. The cuffs were digging deeper now, not from resistance, but from the length of time they'd been on. At the booking desk, the officer behind the glass didn't bother hiding his surprise. "She resisted arrest?" he asked, squinting at the paperwork. Kemp didn't answer. He just shrugged, signed his name, and motioned to the fingerprint scanner. Danielle's fingerprints were taken. Her mugshot snapped. The process was systematic, cold, and mechanical. It was designed not only to process a person, but to strip them down to replace dignity with shame. But Danielle, an attorney who had sat across from men and women going through this very same procedure, wasn't unfamiliar with the mechanics. What stunned her wasn't the process, but the fact that she was now the subject of it. A defendant. Obstruction and resisting the intake officer read off flatly as she was led to a holding cell. "That's what they got you on." "For sitting in a park," Danielle replied calmly. Her voice was even, but her jaw was locked. He didn't respond, just slid the cell door shut. The metal bench was cold. Danielle sat there still in her work slacks, her blouse slightly wrinkled now from the scuffle. She closed her eyes for a moment, then reopened them slowly. The adrenaline had faded. All that remained now was a deep, simmering awareness. She knew the law, and she knew this arrest wouldn't hold up. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be damage. There always was. It was hours before anyone said a word to her again. A young officer, barely out of training by the look of him, approached with a clipboard. "You've been charged," he said without looking her in the eye. "You'll be released on bail shortly." "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice low and cutting. He blinked. "You can take that up in court." Outside, the night air was sharp. Danielle's shoes clicked on the concrete as she walked out of the station. Waiting at the curb was Naomi Shaw, her friend and former law school classmate, now a senior partner at a Denver civil rights firm. Naomi had come the moment she got the call. Danielle climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The silence between them stretched until they pulled into Danielle's driveway. "I'm pressing charges," Danielle said finally, her voice a whisper, but her tone firm. Naomi nodded, eyes locked on the windshield. "Good." Inside her house, Danielle sat at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, legal pads spread out, her laptop glowing. She didn't go to bed. She didn't shower. She drafted the preliminary complaint before the sun came up. The footage hit the internet before noon. The young woman in the park had posted it on her social media, tagging local news outlets. It showed Danielle sitting calmly, officers badgering her. Then the moment she was handcuffed, despite offering no resistance. Within hours, it had been reshared by civil rights groups, journalists, and even a few city council members. "This is what injustice looks like," read one caption. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Former clients, colleagues, even law professors she hadn't spoken to in years. One message stood out. "If you're going to fight, I want in." Thomas Rios, a public defender with a reputation for tearing holes in bad arrests. The legal team came together faster than she expected. Thomas, Naomi, and two associates from a national advocacy group were all in by the weekend. They drafted a civil rights lawsuit citing false arrest, excessive force, and racial profiling. Danielle, for her part, made public appearances sparingly. When she did speak, it was measured. She wasn't interested in yelling over news anchors or pointing fingers. She wanted policy change, internal reviews, retraining programs, oversight. But as the days turned into weeks, the city itself began to shift. Protests formed, quiet ones at first, people gathering outside the courthouse with signs that read, "Justice for Danielle," and "Books, not handcuffs." The mayor issued a carefully worded statement about investigating community concerns, but the public wasn't interested in soft language. Meanwhile, Danielle's law firm stood at a crossroads. A few senior partners worried her case might draw the wrong attention. She sat in their glass conference room and looked them each in the eye. "If it were someone else," she asked, "someone without my title, without my credentials, what would you do?" No one answered, so she left. Not in a blaze of fury, but in quiet defiance. She set up shop in a co-working space 2 blocks from the courthouse. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but to Danielle it felt like purpose. One evening after a community forum at the local rec center, a teenager approached her. "I saw what they did to you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "My brother, they did the same to him. Only he didn't get a video." Danielle knelt slightly to his height. "That's why we fight," she said gently. "So no one gets silenced again." But just as she began to find momentum, something unexpected landed on her desk. A letter from the district judicial office. She'd been assigned as presiding judge for an internal misconduct hearing involving two Boulder police officers, Bradley and Kemp. For a moment, she stared at the paper in disbelief. Then she sat back slow and measured. The very officers who had thrown her into the back of a cruiser would now be standing in her courtroom, answering to someone they once thought powerless. She picked up her pen. The air in the room shifted. This was no longer personal, it was systemic. And the system for once was about to feel the weight of justice. The morning of the hearing, Danielle stood in front of her bathroom mirror, buttoning her black robe with a stillness that came from deep within. It was a ritual she'd performed countless times, but today every motion carried a different weight. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't angry. She was focused. When she arrived at the courthouse, the usual chatter in the hallway hushed a little more quickly than usual. Clerks and attorneys nodded respectfully, but avoided small talk. News of the assignment had already spread through the legal grapevine like wildfire. The idea of Danielle Reeves presiding over the misconduct hearing of the very officers who had once put her in a holding cell, well, it had a poetic symmetry that even seasoned court veterans couldn't ignore. In her chambers, she reviewed the case file again. Not the one from her own lawsuit that was separate and ongoing, but the one she'd been assigned to oversee as judge. This hearing involved an incident just weeks after her arrest. Officers Bradley and Kemp were accused of using excessive force on a young man during a traffic stop. Marcus Hill, 23, no criminal record, graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder. He'd been pulled over for a broken taillight and ended up tackled to the ground when he asked to call his lawyer. Danielle stared at the transcript of Marcus's initial complaint. So many phrases echoed her own experience. He didn't raise his voice. They assumed he was hiding something. He was compliant, but they called it resisting. It wasn't just familiar. It was a pattern. She heard the bailiff knock gently. "They're ready for you, Judge Reeves." She smoothed the folds of her robe and walked out. The courtroom was modest, no sweeping marble columns or dramatic balconies, just rows of wooden benches, soft lighting, and a single elevated bench where Danielle would sit. But today it might as well have been a stage. The moment she entered the room stilled. Even the attorney stopped mid-sentence. Danielle walked with quiet authority to the bench, placed her folder down, and sat. The defendants were already seated at their table. Officer Bradley glanced up, and when he saw her, his face drained of color. Kemp looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Both men fidgeted, Bradley adjusting his collar, Kemp staring down at the polished table as though it might save him. Danielle picked up her gavel. "This hearing is now in session," she said. "Please be seated." The sound of bodies settling into benches echoed like distant thunder. The city's council began the opening statement outlining the complaint against the two officers, an unnecessary escalation of force failure to follow de-escalation protocols and a breach of public trust. As the prosecutor spoke, Danielle watched the officers, not with malice, with focus, with calculation. They were fidgeting again. When the prosecutor called Marcus Hill to the stand, the young man walked up slowly, adjusting his jacket. He glanced once at Danielle, then sat down, hands folded in his lap. "Tell us what happened the night of the incident," the attorney asked. Marcus took a breath. "I was driving home from campus," he said, his voice steady. It was around 9. I got pulled over for a taillight. I rolled down the window, gave my license and registration. Officer Kemp told me to step out of the car. I asked if I could call my attorney. That's when he reached for his belt. Danielle leaned forward, her pen hovering. "Did you resist?" the prosecutor asked. Marcus shook his head. "No, I didn't raise my voice. I kept my hands visible. I just asked a question. And then they pulled me out of the car." Marcus continued. "Officer Bradley held my arm while Officer Kemp tackled me. My face hit the pavement. I remember hearing one of them say I was being uncooperative." He paused. "I've never been more scared in my life." Silence. When the defense attorney stood to cross-examine, he attempted to cast doubt on Marcus's version of events. "Is it possible your tone was perceived as aggressive?" he asked. Marcus blinked. "Asking to call a lawyer isn't aggressive." Danielle glanced over her glasses. That pause, that stillness. It made the defense attorney shrink just a little. Later, Officer Bradley was called to testify. His voice was tight, his answers clipped. "Did you feel threatened during the stop?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Bradley admitted. "But protocol gave us discretion. And do you believe your use of force was appropriate?" Bradley hesitated. "At the time, maybe. But now, I don't know." Kemp's testimony was shakier. He stumbled over his words, avoided eye contact, and couldn't explain why he felt the need to tackle a non-threatening student. "I thought he was reaching for something," he mumbled. "Did he?" the prosecutor asked. No, Kemp admitted after a long pause. His hands were on the steering wheel. Danielle remained composed throughout, but inside she burned. Not with revenge, but with the realization that these officers operated on fear, bias, and instinct, not on facts. The hearing stretched into the late afternoon. During recess, Danielle returned to her chambers, where Naomi was waiting with updates from their civil rights case. "The department's rattled," Naomi said. "The city's attorneys know they're on thin ice." Danielle nodded but didn't smile. "It's not about the lawsuit anymore. It's about trust. Public trust. And it's crumbling." That evening, Danielle reviewed her notes under the amber glow of her desk lamp. Her mind wasn't on punishment. It was on reform. She knew the hearing wouldn't erase what happened to Marcus. It wouldn't undo what happened to her. But it could send a message. And in a system where messages are often buried beneath bureaucracy, that meant something. Tomorrow she would issue her ruling. Tonight she would write it. The following morning, the courtroom filled faster than anyone expected. Word had spread through headlines, social media, and whispered conversations at cafes that Judge Danielle Reeves was set to deliver her ruling on the misconduct hearing of Officers Bradley and Kemp. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder at the back of the room, their pens poised, cameras quietly rolling. Rows of citizens, some in business suits, others in hoodies and jeans, filled every seat. Some had seen the viral video. Others just wanted to witness what justice looked like when the roles were finally reversed. Danielle stepped into the courtroom with quiet composure, her black robe flowing behind her like a slow-moving wave. She ascended the bench and sat, her face calm but unreadable. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. She gave a brief nod to the attorneys and looked down at the folder before her. It wasn't just paper. It was testimony, evidence, character, and consequence. She began slowly. "The role of law enforcement," Danielle said, her voice clear and measured, "is to protect and serve with integrity, professionalism, and accountability. When that trust is violated, the damage extends far beyond a single person. It erodes the relationship between the community and the very institutions meant to keep it safe." You could hear the breath of the room pause. Danielle continued. "In this hearing, we have reviewed testimony, examined video footage, and considered official protocol. It is my judgment that the actions of Officers Bradley and Kemp during the stop involving Mr. Marcus Hill constituted an excessive and unwarranted use of force. Mr. Hill posed no threat. His request to contact legal counsel was reasonable, protected, and did not justify the escalation that followed." She paused for a heartbeat. The officers acted with a disregard for policy and the dignity of the individual in their custody. For this, they will be formally reprimanded, placed on a 6-month unpaid suspension, and required to complete comprehensive retraining focused on de-escalation, civil rights law, and cultural sensitivity. Their conduct will be recorded in their permanent service files, and any future infractions of similar nature will result in dismissal. Bradley didn't flinch. Kemp's eyes dropped to the floor. Danielle didn't look at either of them. She tapped the gavel once. "This ruling is final. Court is adjourned." A collective exhale swept the room as the audience slowly rose to their feet. The quiet shuffle of footsteps began, some hesitant, some purposeful. No cheers, no applause, just a deep, resonating silence that said everything. Bradley stood, adjusted his badge awkwardly, and began to walk out. But halfway down the aisle, he paused, then slowly turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, voice low. "I'm sorry." Danielle met his gaze for the first time since the trial began. "I understand," she said quietly. But apology means nothing without change. He nodded once more, shaken than she'd ever seen him, and turned away. When the courtroom cleared, Naomi stepped into Danielle's chambers holding her phone. "You should see this," she said, handing it over. A news clip had already been uploaded, not of the ruling, but of the courtroom before it began, of the packed gallery, the tension, the way Danielle carried herself with grace and power. The caption read, "The judge they never saw coming." Danielle smiled faintly, catchy, but what followed was no longer a moment, it was a movement. That week, Danielle was invited to speak at a university town hall on the future of community policing. She declined every cable news appearance but agreed to a local interview where she laid out a plan for structural reform, updated training protocols, community oversight boards, and the expansion of legal education for young adults. She didn't speak from a place of bitterness. She spoke from experience. She told them about the boy at the park who watched it all unfold and probably carried that image in his memory. She told them about Marcus Hill and how easily he could have become just another statistic. She even told them without naming names about being handcuffed for reading a book under an oak tree. And she told them what she told herself that night in her kitchen. We cannot fight bias with silence. We fight it with law, with clarity, with consequence. Soon after, her civil rights lawsuit was scheduled for hearing in federal court. But this time, the department didn't dig in its heels. They requested mediation. An internal probe had begun into the culture of the local precinct. Several officers were being reassigned. A task force was being formed. It wasn't justice wrapped in a bow, but it was a start. At a community meeting later that month, an older man stood up, a Vietnam veteran with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. "My granddaughter was there at the park that day," he said, his voice trembling. "She said she'd never seen someone stay that calm while being treated that wrong. She didn't have the words for it, but I told her she just saw what dignity looks like." Danielle didn't know how to respond, so she nodded. Once, slowly. Outside the courthouse later that day, a small group of college students gathered with signs, not in protest but in hope. "Trust begins with truth," one read. Another, "More judges like her." Danielle stood behind a pillar and watched from a distance. She didn't wave. She didn't step into the light, because this wasn't about her face. It was about what it stood for. And as she turned to walk back inside, her pace slow and certain, she thought to herself, this is what accountability feels like. Not a spotlight, a direction. The seasons had begun to change. Crisp air swept through the streets of Boulder as golden leaves danced across sidewalks and front porches. Danielle Reeves, once the subject of a viral injustice, had become something more than a symbol. She had become a steward of transformation. It had been 3 weeks since the ruling. The civil case she'd filed months prior was now gaining traction. Mediation had been productive. The department, under mounting pressure from both the public and federal oversight, agreed not only to a settlement, but also to launch a publicly accountable review board that included civilian voices. Danielle didn't care about the dollar amount. What she demanded and won was transparency. But that didn't mean the fight was over. At her new office, a modest suite above a cafe downtown, Danielle sat surrounded by open case files and manila folders. The desk was cluttered with sticky notes, draft legislation, and 2 empty coffee cups. A soft jazz track played from the speaker in the corner, but her focus was elsewhere. She had begun mentoring law students from around the state, many of them young Black women who had watched the courtroom video and saw in her a future they hadn't imagined possible before. Ms. Reeves, one intern, had said, wide-eyed and breathless, "You're the reason I applied to law school." Danielle had smiled but said nothing then, because the truth was, she never wanted this kind of notoriety. She never asked to be the face of anything. She just wanted to sit on a park bench and read a book in peace. But that moment was stolen, and maybe in some strange design of the universe, it was meant to light the way for others. The ripple effect continued. She was now consulting with city officials across Colorado on police accountability programs. In Denver, she'd helped draft a model for a citywide civilian review board. In Fort Collins, she spoke to cadets at the police academy about constitutional rights and bias training. They listened, some uncomfortably, some sincerely. A few reached out afterward, thanking her for the clarity. Still, not all responses were warm. She received her share of anonymous letters. Most were filled with coded resentment. Others weren't coded at all. One read simply, You should have just stayed quiet. Danielle didn't flinch. She saved it, tacked it on a bulletin board in her home office next to a photo of herself at the bench and a sticky note that read, "Truth doesn't whisper." It was a reminder. Change always stirs discomfort, and silence never saves anyone. On a windy Sunday morning, she returned to that park. The same bench, the same pond, different leaves. She sat down, opened a book, and read quietly. People passed. No one interrupted. No one asked for ID. Across the grass, she noticed a little boy riding a scooter toward the swing set. He stopped briefly, squinted in her direction, then hurried back to his mother, whispering something in her ear. The mother turned, locked eyes with Danielle, and mouthed a soft, "Thank you." Danielle gave a subtle nod. The moment passed like wind, gentle, unannounced, but unforgettable. Later that afternoon, a peaceful rally unfolded on the courthouse steps. College students, families, community leaders, all gathered under a banner that read, "Justice is not a moment. It's a movement." Danielle didn't take the podium. She stood off to the side, arms folded, watching the younger generation take charge, organizing voter registrations, sharing resources, leading chants for reform, not revenge. This, she thought, is what mattered. Not the court transcripts, not the media buzz, but this. The fire had caught on. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the flatirons, casting long orange shadows over the rooftops, Danielle returned home. She stood by her window, watching the sky shift from amber to dusk. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Marcus Hill. "I got accepted into Georgetown Law. Thank you for seeing me, for believing me, for showing me how to fight back with grace." She read it twice, then smiled. Not all stories needed gavel strikes or viral clips. Some victories came in the quiet, in the everyday steps that followed. And as Danielle sat at her table, sipping tea and making notes for her next town hall, she understood something she hadn't that day in the park. Justice isn't just about consequences, it's about course correction. And she would keep walking that path deliberately, quietly, always forward. As we close this story, take a breath with me. What happened to Danielle Reeves could happen in any town, to any person quietly minding their own business. A misjudgment, a rushed decision, a refusal to see someone's humanity, it can flip a peaceful afternoon into a personal reckoning. But what made Danielle's story different wasn't just her legal training or the viral video. It was her choice to stand firm, not in anger, but in truth. To take her experience and use it to carve a better path, not just for herself, but for others. There's a lesson in that for all of us. In a world quick to judge and even quicker to forget, holding your ground with dignity can shake foundations. Change doesn't always roar from microphones. Sometimes it begins in silence, then builds with every deliberate, persistent step toward justice. So if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or pushed aside, remember Danielle. Remember that your voice, your presence, and your resilience can change more than just your story. It can influence an entire system. And maybe that's what real justice looks like. If this story moved you, I invite you to share it. Let someone else hear the sound of change. And as always, thank you for listening.